47 seconds. That's how long the black waitress had between realizing she'd overheard a Korean mafia boss's plan and deciding whether she would walk out of the restaurant alive or be erased before dessert plates were cleared. By the end of those 47 seconds, a plan designed to end multiple lives would be quietly ruined. A man whose name made rooms go silent would lose control in front of witnesses he could not touch. And a woman no one could remember serving their drinks would become the most dangerous person in the building. Because when the plan collapsed, it didn't happen with shouting or guns or blood on the marble floor. It happened in public. Clean. Irreversible. With eyes everywhere. And survival, hers, was never guaranteed. The restaurant was the kind of place where money softened voices and danger wore tailored suits. Crystal glasses caught the light just enough to dazzle. Conversations stayed low, measured, expensive. This was not a room where violence announced itself. This was where violence was scheduled. The man at the center of it all didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The table leaned toward him without realizing they were doing it. Phones stayed face down. Chairs remained still. Decisions were being made that wouldn't make the news, but would change who didn't make it home. And 10 feet away, balancing a tray she'd carried 1,000 times before, stood a waitress who knew how to disappear. She had learned early that invisibility was a kind of armor. Don't linger. Don't interrupt. Don't exist longer than necessary. She wore it well, simple uniform, quiet steps, eyes lowered just enough to be forgettable. The kind of woman powerful men spoke around, never to. That's why the sentence slipped past their guard. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Efficient. The kind of sentence spoken by people who expected compliance, not consequences. The kind of sentence that assumed everyone within earshot either belonged or didn't matter. In that moment, the waitress understood 3 things with brutal clarity. First, the plan was already in motion. Second, witnesses were not part of the plan. Third, she had just become one. Across the table, the boss smiled faintly as if discussing logistics for a shipment, not human lives. His hands were clean. His expression calm. This was how power operated, quiet, assured, certain it would not be challenged. Around him sat men who knew better than to react. Men who would later say they hadn't noticed anything unusual. Men who would still be alive tomorrow because they hadn't been close enough to hear what she had heard. The waitress's heart didn't race. It slowed. Her body did what it had been trained to do by years of surviving spaces that were never built for her. It assessed exits, angles, timing. Not panic. Calculation. 40 seconds. She could walk away. Finish her shift. Go home. Pretend the words hadn't lodged themselves into her bones. Pretend she wasn't already marked by proximity alone. Or she could do something no one would expect. Because here was the truth no one at that table considered: the plan relied on silence. On privacy. On the assumption that control meant the ability to act unseen. And in a room this public, this watched, violence had rules. Cameras. Phones. Staff. Guests. Too many variables. Too many witnesses. Too much attention. The waitress shifted her grip on the tray. Took one step closer than protocol allowed. Close enough to be noticed. Close enough to be remembered. Across the room, someone laughed at the wrong moment. A glass chimed. A server froze, sensing a disturbance without understanding it. The air tightened. Not with fear, but with anticipation. 30 seconds. The boss finally looked up. Not at her face. At the movement. At the disruption of a pattern that had never failed him before. That was when he realized something was wrong. Because plans like his didn't unravel from the top down. They unraveled when the wrong person heard the wrong sentence at the wrong time and decided not to disappear. What happened next would stop the room cold. Not because of what she said, but because of where she said it. Not because she was brave, but because she was precise. And when the moment passed, and the boss recalculated with eyes that promised memory, one thing would be certain. The most dangerous person in the restaurant had never been sitting at the table. But to understand how a waitress became the single point of failure in a criminal empire's plan, you have to go back to the moment she was assigned to a table she was never meant to hear. And a conversation she was never meant to survive. Why was she close enough to hear anything at all? She learned invisibility before she learned confidence. Not because anyone taught her, but because the world rewarded it. Because silence drew less attention than protest. Because stillness meant survival. Because being seen, fully seen, had consequences she couldn't afford. Her name was Nia. It existed on paperwork, on a faded ID card in her wallet, on a lease agreement that felt more like a monthly threat than a home. In the restaurant, her name rarely mattered. She was server, miss, excuse me, or nothing at all. Most days started the same way. Alarm before dawn. A few seconds of staring at the ceiling, negotiating with her body. Then movement. Routine. Coffee if there was time. A uniform pressed just enough to pass inspection. Shoes chosen for durability, not comfort. She counted bus stops in her head like a metronome, each one a reminder that being late was a luxury she didn't have. By the time she clocked in, she had already been awake for hours. The shifts were long. Double shifts more often than not. The pay barely stretched, and tips were a gamble she learned not to depend on. Some nights were generous. Others were humiliating. Smiles were mandatory regardless. Nia didn't complain. Complaints got remembered. She learned early how to read people the way others read menus. Who wanted small talk? Who wanted efficiency? Who wanted to feel important? Who wanted someone to blame? She adjusted her tone, her posture, even her breathing to match expectations. It wasn't deception. It was calibration. Survival required flexibility. Invisibility wasn't about being ignored completely. It was about being unremarkable. Neutral. Unmemorable. The kind of presence that left no impression once it passed. She watched coworkers try different strategies. Some leaned into charm. Some into humor. Some into defiance. Those ones burned brightest and disappeared fastest. Transfers. Write-ups. Quiet firings after complaints that couldn't be disproven. Nia chose the middle ground. Polite. Efficient. Gone before you noticed she'd been there. At night, back in her apartment, she'd sit on the edge of the bed and count tips with careful fingers. Rent first. Utilities second. Groceries third. Anything left went into a mental drawer labeled later. Later was vague. Later was fragile. Later was hope, and she didn't handle it often. She slept lightly. Always had. Years of shared walls, sirens, neighbors arguing through thin doors had trained her nervous system to stay alert. She woke easily. She listened before moving. Control, she'd learned, was knowing when not to draw attention. The restaurant where she worked was the opposite of her life. It was money made visible. Crystal and marble and fabric chosen for how it absorbed sound. Lighting designed to flatter faces and hide flaws. Even silence here felt curated, expensive. People entered differently. They slowed their steps, lowered their voices, smoothed their clothes. This space demanded a certain posture, and most people obeyed without realizing they were doing it. Conversations stayed contained within table boundaries. Laughter never spilled too loudly. Phones were placed screen down not out of etiquette, but confidence. No one here needed to be reachable. Nia felt the difference the moment she stepped inside. The temperature. The smell. The weight of expectation. There was an unspoken hierarchy that governed everything. Hosts at the door smiled more broadly at certain guests. Managers appeared faster at specific tables. Apologies were offered preemptively to the right people. Fear existed here, but it was dressed well. It lived in the way staff straightened when certain men entered. In the way conversations paused half a beat too long. In the way a table could command silence without asking for it. Nia noticed things most people missed. She noticed when security shifted positions. When the manager stopped smiling. When servers exchanged glances instead of words. Tonight, something was different. Not wrong. Not yet. Just taut. Like a wire pulled tighter than usual. She couldn't name it, only feel it. The room held itself carefully, as if anticipating impact. The VIP booths were set slightly apart, shielded by decorative screens that suggested privacy without offering real separation. They were upholstered in dark leather that didn't show wear, no matter how often they were used. Some booths mattered more than others. Booth 9 was one of them. No one volunteered for Booth 9. No one joked about it. When guests sat there, the manager handled introductions personally. Orders were repeated back twice. Plates were checked before leaving the kitchen. Mistakes near Booth 9 didn't result in scoldings. They resulted in consequences. Nia had seen the aftermath without ever being told the story. A server quietly removed from the schedule. A bartender transferred without explanation. A host who stopped showing up altogether. Booth 9 belonged to people whose power didn't need to be announced. They weren't loud. They weren't flashy. They didn't posture. They spoke softly and expected obedience. Staff avoided lingering near that booth. Not out of superstition. Out of instinct. No one here needed to be reachable. Nia felt the difference the moment she stepped inside. The temperature. The smell. The weight of expectation. There was an unspoken hierarchy that governed everything. Hosts at the door smiled more broadly at certain guests. Managers appeared faster at specific tables. Apologies were offered preemptively to the right people. Fear existed here, but it was dressed well. It lived in the way staff straightened when certain men entered. In the way conversations paused half a beat too long. In the way a table could command silence without asking for it. Nia noticed things most people missed. She noticed when security shifted positions. When the manager stopped smiling. When servers exchanged glances instead of words. Tonight, something was different. Not wrong. Not yet. Just taut. Like a wire pulled tighter than usual. She couldn't name it, only feel it. The room held itself carefully, as if anticipating impact. The VIP booths were set slightly apart, shielded by decorative screens that suggested privacy without offering real separation. They were upholstered in dark leather that didn't show wear, no matter how often they were used. Some booths mattered more than others. Booth 9 was one of them. No one volunteered for Booth 9. No one joked about it. When guests sat there, the manager handled introductions personally. Orders were repeated back twice. Plates were checked before leaving the kitchen. Mistakes near booth 9 didn't result in scoldings. They resulted in consequences. Nia had seen the aftermath without ever being told the story. A server quietly removed from the schedule. A bartender transferred without explanation. A host who stopped showing up altogether. Booth 9 belonged to people whose power didn't need to be announced. They weren't loud. They weren't flashy. They didn't posture. They spoke softly and expected obedience. Staff avoided lingering near that booth. Not out of superstition. Out of instinct. Nia had never asked why. Asking implied curiosity. Curiosity invited attention. She stayed in her section. Focused on what she could control. Plates. Glasses. Steps. When the host stand grew quiet all at once, she noticed. When the manager's jaw tightened, she noticed. When conversation dipped near the VIP area, she noticed. Booth 9 was occupied again. She saw it without looking directly. The way you sense a storm without seeing the clouds. 4 men. Still. Composed. Their presence changed the room's rhythm. Nia adjusted her apron and moved on. Then the manager approached. "Section change," he said, casual, clipboard tucked under his arm. She looked up. "Okay. Take booth 9 for now." The words landed heavier than they should have. Nia didn't react. Reaction drew attention. She simply nodded. "Yes, sir." No explanation followed. No context. No reassurance. The manager handed her the updated assignment and moved away too quickly. That was the first warning sign. As she approached the booth, the absence of sound around it became more noticeable. Nearby tables angled away. Conversations softened. A server passing by avoided eye contact. Second warning sign. Nia slowed her steps just enough to steady herself. She adjusted her grip on the water pitcher. Centered her breathing. Professional. Neutral. Invisible. Up close, the table radiated control. 4 men in tailored clothing. Calm faces. Postures that didn't shift when she approached. One of them glanced at her, not with interest, not with desire, but with evaluation. A quick assessment. Then dismissal. She placed the water glasses down carefully. Hands steady. Eyes lowered respectfully. That was when she heard his voice. Low. Measured. Certain. She didn't understand every word, but she didn't need to. The accent was unmistakable. Korean. The kind she'd heard in documentaries, in whispered news stories, in cautionary conversations that ended with "don't get involved." Her stomach tightened, not with panic, but recognition. This wasn't just a VIP table. This was the table. The realization didn't hit all at once. It settled slowly, heavily, like a door locking behind her. Nia kept her expression blank. Professional. Forgettable. But inside, something shifted. Because she knew exactly who was sitting in her section. And standing that close to him, she understood something she'd never had to consider before. Invisibility wasn't protection anymore. It was proximity. And as she turned away from the table, heart steady but mind alert, she felt the weight of that truth follow her across the room. She had been assigned to the wrong table. And she didn't yet know that this assignment was already pulling her into a story where disappearing would no longer be an option. The man at booth 9 didn't need to raise his voice. That was the first thing Nia understood. Power announced itself here in absence, in the lack of urgency, the way everyone else adjusted around him without being told. He sat with his back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely on the table when not lifting a glass. His suit was dark, perfectly tailored, unremarkable in a way that suggested it didn't need to impress anyone. The men with him deferred without obvious submission. They leaned slightly toward him when speaking, paused before responding, laughed a half-second later than they would have with anyone else, as if waiting for permission. No one interrupted him. When Nia approached with plates, conversation didn't stop. It didn't need to. He didn't lower his voice either. He simply spoke as though the world around him was irrelevant, as the walls and witnesses and consequences bent naturally to his intent. She kept her eyes on the table. Placed dishes down with careful precision. Left space between herself and the booth without making it obvious. He acknowledged her presence once, with a brief nod that wasn't gratitude or dismissal. Just recognition. Like noting a doorframe. Something fixed. Something expected to stay where it was. That nod did more to unsettle her than shouting ever could have. Violence would have been easier to understand. This was different. This was control so absolute it didn't require display. As the night progressed, she saw the pattern repeat. A man in an expensive watch approached the booth, posture eager, words rehearsed. He didn't sit without invitation. He spoke quickly, carefully, eyes flicking toward the boss's face for cues. The boss listened. Expression neutral. No reaction. The man finished speaking and waited. A pause stretched. Not awkward. Deliberate. The boss said one word. No. Not loud. Not harsh. Just final. The man nodded immediately, murmured something apologetic, and backed away as though released from gravity. His shoulders slumped only after he reached the edge of the VIP area. Nia watched from the corner of her eye while refilling glasses at another table. That was rejection here. Silent. Clean. Irrevocable. Later, another man tried a different approach. Humor. Familiarity. A hand briefly touching the booth's edge. The boss didn't look at him. One of the men beside him did. That was enough. The man withdrew his hand as if burned. Apologized without being prompted. Left. No threats. No raised voices. No security escort. Just decisions made and obeyed. Nia felt it in her body before her mind fully processed it. Her shoulders stayed tight. Her jaw clenched unconsciously. Her breath shortened whenever she crossed the invisible boundary around booth 9. Her instincts didn't scream yet. They whispered. Pay attention. She began to notice how often she was near without meaning to be. Assigned refills. Cleared plates. Wine checks timed precisely when conversations paused. Each time, she positioned herself so she could leave quickly if needed. Each time, she stayed just long enough to do her job. Once, she nearly lingered too long.
You don't know enough. But that was the lie people tell themselves when knowing too much becomes inconvenient. I did know enough. I knew there were people positioned around the room like furniture. I knew languages had shifted when plans became serious. I knew Carolina's laughter was too precise, too measured, like she was hitting marks only she could see. And I knew something else, something colder. If I walked away now, I'd hear the sound later. A crack. A scream. glass shattering. And I'd carry it with me forever. My eyes found Kong Min-jun again. His smile hadn't faded yet. I had maybe seconds before it did. My breath shortened. Think. Calling the police would take too long. Creating a scene would escalate things immediately. Running wouldn't save anyone. Not in a room already mapped for violence. There was only one option left. Warning him. Not loudly. Not visibly. A whisper. Something small enough not to trigger panic. Sharp enough to cut through the illusion. Dangerous enough to change the board. My stomach twisted. I'd never spoken to him directly before. Never crossed that invisible line between service and presence. Waitresses weren't supposed to exist beyond plates and smiles. But this wouldn't be service. This would be interference. The clock started ticking in my head. 10 seconds. The man at the bar lifted his glass but didn't drink. 8 seconds. Carolina leaned closer, her voice low, intimate. 6 seconds. My feet moved before my fear could stop them. I picked up a tray, empty, light, an excuse, and stepped out from behind the service station. Each step toward table 1 felt heavier than the last, like gravity had decided to argue with me personally. 4 seconds. The lights seemed brighter near the table. Or maybe my senses were just sharpening, every detail carving itself into memory. The cut of Kong Min-jun's suit. The faint scar near his jaw. The way his eyes softened when Carolina touched his hand. 3 seconds.
The thought barely formed before she dismissed it. Drawing attention now would only raise questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Scrutiny was dangerous. Still, her nerves buzzed. Her feet ached from standing, but the urge to leave grew stronger with every passing minute. At one point, she stepped into the service hallway and pressed her palms briefly against the cool metal of a prep table, breathing slowly. "You're fine," she told herself. "You don't know anything. You haven't heard anything." The door to the dining room opened, and voices drifted in. She straightened immediately. Back out there, she resumed her careful orbit. The boss's table ordered dessert. Espresso. Nothing unusual. Then, as she approached with the cups, something changed. The room was louder than before, laughter from a nearby table, a clink of silverware, music swelling just slightly. "Cover." The boss leaned back, crossing his arms loosely. One of the men to his left spoke, low and fast, irritation slipping through his controlled tone. Nia set down the cups, heart hammering. She should have stepped away. She didn't. Not because she wanted to hear. Because her body froze. "No loose ends," the boss said calmly. The words sliced through the noise with terrifying clarity. Her breath stopped. For half a second, the world narrowed to that sentence. Simple. Complete. Impossible to misunderstand. No loose ends. Her mind raced, filling in blanks she didn't want to see. The boss turned his head slightly, eyes lifting. Not to her face. To where she stood. Their gazes didn't meet. But she knew. In that instant, denial shattered. Fear took its place. And tension snapped tight as a wire pulled to breaking. The plan wasn't spoken all at once. That was the cruelest part. It came in fragments, spaced between sips of espresso and the low murmur of surrounding tables. Wrapped in calm language. Delivered like routine logistics instead of something that would end lives before sunrise. Nia stood at the service station pretending to polish glassware she had already cleaned twice. She wasn't supposed to be listening. But now that she had heard no loose ends, her brain refused to let go. Her ears strained without permission. "Window closes at 2, one of the men said quietly, his tone clipped. "Traffic control is already arranged," another added. The boss responded after a pause. His voice stayed even. "Almost bored." "Then there's no reason to delay." Nia's fingers tightened around the stem of the glass. "Delay what?" She took a step back, then another, putting distance between herself and booth 9. Her heart beat too fast, a dull roar filling her ears. She told herself she hadn't heard enough. That fragments meant nothing without context. But her body didn't believe the lie. She moved toward the kitchen entrance, intending to ask the manager for a bathroom break, anything to get away, but a runner passed her with a tray, blocking her path. She sidestepped, nearly colliding with a server from another section. "Sorry," the girl whispered. Nia nodded, pulse skidding. When she reached the edge of the dining room, the sound changed. Music swelled. Laughter spiked. The illusion of normalcy pressed in, sharp and unreal. She exhaled slowly. Then she heard it. Clear this time. "The driver won't make it past the bridge." Her breath caught. That sentence landed whole. Driver. Bridge. Won't make it. Her stomach dropped as understanding snapped into place with brutal clarity. This wasn't money laundering. Or extortion. Or threats. This was a hit. Time sensitive. Planned. Already in motion. She knew that tone. She'd grown up hearing it secondhand in stories whispered by neighbors who knew when not to ask questions. Calm meant certainty. Calm meant it was already decided. The boss spoke again, and this time there was no mistaking it. "By morning, anyone who heard this conversation will be irrelevant." Nia's vision tunneled. The restaurant felt suddenly too bright, too exposed. Every reflective surface seemed to broadcast her presence back at her. Her name tag felt like a beacon pinned to her chest. Anyone who heard this conversation. Her mind raced backward, replaying the last 10 minutes with merciless precision. How close had she been? How long had she lingered? Had anyone noticed her pause? Her hands shook. She shoved them into her apron pockets, grounding herself with the rough fabric. People would die. Not hypothetically. Not someday. Tonight. And if she had heard this, if she was counted as a witness, then she wasn't just in danger. She was already part of the equation. A laugh erupted from a nearby table, sharp and jarring. Someone clinked a glass for a toast. The world kept spinning. Nia swallowed hard, forcing air into her lungs. Panic clawed at her chest, urging her to run, to do something reckless just to escape the pressure building inside her. She scanned the exits. Front door, crowded, monitored by security she didn't trust to help her. Back alley, narrow, dark, watched. Kitchen, staff everywhere, cameras, nowhere to hide. There was no clean exit. Minutes mattered. She could feel time compressing, each second stretching thin and brittle. The boss's table would leave soon. Plans would move forward. And she would still be here, breathing too loud, thinking too much. The room transformed in her perception. Tables became obstacles. Patrons became witnesses. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. Every path out led past booth 9. A trap. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from another server asking if she could cover a section for 5 minutes. The normalcy of it almost broke her. She wanted to scream. Instead, she typed back a single word with shaking fingers. Busy. Her thoughts spiraled. If she fled now, would that mark her? Would someone notice the sudden absence? Was she already being watched? Her gaze flicked involuntarily toward booth 9. The boss was listening as one of his men spoke, his expression unreadable. His eyes lifted briefly, sweeping the room. They passed over her. Or did they linger? She couldn't tell. Her heart slammed painfully against her ribs. She forced herself to move, to act natural, to pick up a tray and walk as if she belonged exactly where she was. Each step felt deliberate, heavy. Fight, flee, freeze. The options surfaced unbidden. Flee, impossible without being seen. Freeze, she was already doing that, and it would get her killed. Fight, laughable. She had no weapon. No authority. No power. Unless. The thought arrived quietly, almost gently. Leverage. Her breath hitched. She replayed the conversation again, slower this time. Not just the words, but the setting. The openness. The timing. They were discussing this here. In public. That meant they believed themselves untouchable. Or that they didn't think anyone like her counted. Her chest tightened as clarity cut through the panic. She wasn't dangerous because she was strong. She was dangerous because she was invisible. Because no one had checked to see if she was listening. Because they assumed silence where there was none. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a server. It was an unknown number. A single message appeared. Stay in your section. Her blood ran cold. They were watching her. Her pulse slowed abruptly, clarity sharpening into something cold and focused. If she did nothing, people would die, and she would likely disappear quietly after. If she ran, she would confirm their suspicion. But if she used what she knew, if she disrupted the plan publicly, altered the variables, forced witnesses where none were expected, she might survive. The cost was exposure. Once she acted, there would be no going back to invisibility. No slipping away unnoticed. Every eye in the room would turn toward her. And the man at booth 9 would know she existed. Nia lifted her head, heart pounding with terrifying resolve. She had leverage. Using it might save lives. It might also make her the next loose end. Nia stopped shaking. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But the wild, ungoverned panic that had been clawing at her chest eased into something sharper, colder. Fear didn't disappear, it reorganized. Became useful. She replayed the fragments again, slower now, forcing herself to hear what had been said instead of what it meant. Window closes at 2. Driver won't make it past the bridge. No loose ends. Time. Movement. Witness control. Plans like this depended on precision. On silence. On everyone doing exactly what they were supposed to do, exactly when they were supposed to do it. And on one more thing. Predictability. The flaw wasn't in the violence. It wasn't in the logistics. It was in the setting. They were doing this here. In a restaurant full of people. Cameras. Phones. Staff. Diners who mistook proximity to power for safety and documented everything for social proof. They believed public space made them untouchable. That it blurred accountability. That no one would dare interrupt, much less interfere. But public space worked both ways. Public space created witnesses. Nia glanced around, her gaze sweeping the room with new intent. The couple near the window laughing too loudly. The group of influencers angling their phones just right to catch candlelight and champagne. The older man at the bar who filmed everything because it made him feel relevant. So many eyes. So many records. The boss's reputation depended on control, on the myth that he operated above chaos. Violence was supposed to be surgical. Clean. Invisible. A scene would ruin that. A public disruption, especially one that forced attention, questions, recordings, would contaminate everything. Delay timelines. Introduce uncertainty. Unacceptable variables. She felt her breathing slow as the realization settled. He couldn't execute the plan if the room became unstable. And instability was something she could create. Her advantage wasn't strength or authority. It was access. She could move through the room without suspicion. Speak without being questioned. Interrupt without being challenged, because no one expected her to matter. Invisibility wasn't just protection. It was leverage. She thought about the cameras mounted discreetly in the corners. About how quickly clips spread when something unexpected happened. About how the boss's calm, controlled image would fracture under public scrutiny. Reputation vulnerability. Men like him survived on myth. On fear wrapped in elegance. Exposure was poison. Her phone buzzed again. Water service now. A directive. Casual. Commanding. Her jaw tightened. They were testing her. Watching how she moved. Whether she complied. She slipped the phone back into her pocket without responding. Her heart thudded steadily now, no longer frantic. She could feel each beat, strong and deliberate. The plan hinged on silence. She could break that. But breaking it meant choosing. And choice brought consequence. Her thoughts turned inward despite her effort to stay focused. If she acted, there would be no undoing it. No pretending she hadn't heard anything. No fading back into the background at the end of the shift. Men like him didn't forget disruptions. Even if she survived tonight, what about tomorrow? Next week? A year from now? She imagined her name whispered in rooms she'd never enter. Her face memorized. Her routines observed. She had worked her entire life to stay small enough not to be noticed. Stepping into the light felt like stepping off a cliff. But silence guaranteed deaths. That truth pressed heavy against her ribs. Somewhere, a driver would follow instructions, unaware he'd been condemned. Somewhere, families would wake up to news that made no sense, that would never be fully explained. And she would know she could have changed it. Her hands curled into fists inside her apron. Fear rose again, but this time, it was clean. Focused. She thought of her mother, exhausted hands folded around cheap coffee, always telling her the same thing. If you see something wrong and you do nothing, you're still part of it. Nia exhaled slowly. There was no version of this where she walked away untouched. But there was one where fewer people died. She checked the room again, mapping sightlines, sound, attention. The boss's table was still the gravitational center, but people were restless. Phones already out. Waiting for something to happen, even if they didn't know what. She could give them that. She reached the service station, picked up a tray she didn't need, and adjusted her posture. Straightened her back. Lifted her chin. Her movements changed subtly, still professional, still controlled, but no longer shrinking. She stepped deliberately into open space instead of skirting edges. A few heads turned. Nothing dramatic. Yet. She felt the weight of the moment settle over her, heavy and irreversible. Once she spoke, there would be no retreat. Once she disrupted the flow, the plan would fracture or accelerate. She had to be precise. She crossed the room, every step measured, pulse steady. She could feel eyes tracking her now, curiosity blooming where indifference had been. When she reached the edge of Booth 9's invisible boundary, she didn't stop. She stepped into it. The conversation halted. Not abruptly. Just enough. The boss looked up. For the first time that night, his gaze landed fully on her. Assessment flickered there. Recognition. Calculation. Nia met his eyes without flinching. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. Clear. Loud enough to carry. And the room leaned in as the invisible waitress stepped into the spotlight. Nia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She set the tray down on the edge of the table, his table, with a soft, deliberate sound that cut cleanly through the low murmur of the room. Glass against wood. Every head within 10 feet turned. "I'm sorry," she said evenly, eyes on the man at the center of the booth, "but I believe there's been a mistake." The sentence was harmless. Polite. Perfectly ordinary. That was what made it impossible to ignore. The men beside him stiffened instantly. One of them half rose from the booth before catching himself. Another's hand dropped beneath the table. The boss didn't move. He studied her the way a chess player studies a board after an unexpected move, not angry, not startled, but alert. Fully present. "A mistake," he repeated, tone mild. Nia nodded once. Slow. Controlled. Yes. The timing. A ripple of unease moved through the booth. A few nearby tables leaned closer, sensing something off without knowing why. Phones tilted upward, casual recording turning instinctive. The boss smiled faintly. Not warmth, acknowledgement. "You'll need to be more specific," he said. Nia inhaled. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. "The bridge is closed for construction after midnight," she said calmly. "Traffic cameras reroute automatically. There's a 12-minute delay you didn't account for." A hush fell. Someone laughed nervously at a nearby table, then stopped when no one joined in. The boss's smile didn't falter, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "That information is incorrect," he said. "It was updated an hour ago," Nia replied. "City site. Public record." One of the men beside him turned sharply. "That's not possible." The boss lifted a single finger. Silence snapped into place. Nia could feel her pulse in her throat, but her voice remained steady. "If the driver leaves on schedule," she continued, "he'll still be on the bridge when the detour hits. Which means cameras. Witnesses. A traffic backup that can't be controlled." The word witnesses landed heavy. Phones were no longer subtle. People openly recorded now, sensing something rare and volatile unfolding. The boss leaned back slightly, regarding her with renewed interest. "And you felt compelled to bring this to my attention," he said, because I'm standing here," Nia said, "and that means I heard you." The room froze. That sentence did what no threat could. It reframed everything. The boss didn't respond immediately. He didn't have to. His silence carried weight, stretched thin and dangerous. Violence hovered at the edges of the moment, everyone felt it, but it couldn't land. Not here. Not now. Not with this many eyes. Power had shifted, just enough. "You're very confident," he said at last. Nia met his gaze. "I'm very aware." A murmur rippled outward. Whispers. Sharp inhales. Someone muttered, What the hell? The boss glanced around the room, not hurriedly, but deliberately, taking stock of the audience. The phones. The servers frozen mid-step. The patrons who would remember this night no matter how it ended. He returned his attention to her. "Do you enjoy attention?" he asked. "No," Nia said. "I enjoy living." The line landed like a blade. For the first time, something like genuine amusement flickered across his face. "You're disrupting a private conversation," he said carefully. "In a public space," she replied. "With public consequences." One of the men leaned in, whispering urgently in Korean. The boss didn't look away from her as he listened. The seconds stretched. Nia could feel the room tipping, control slipping, balance shifting. This was the edge. The point where something broke or recalibrated. The boss exhaled softly. "You've put me in an awkward position," he said. She nodded. That was the idea. A few gasps escaped nearby. He considered her for a long moment, then spoke loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "It seems," he said, "that discretion has failed us tonight." His men went still. Nia's stomach clenched, but she held her ground. "Fortunately," he continued, "I prefer adjustments over accidents." He turned his head slightly, addressing one of his men without lowering his voice. "Delay," he said. "Change the route. Cancel the bridge." The man hesitated, just a fraction, then nodded and stood, phone already in hand. A collective exhale swept the room. People didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just stared. The boss looked back at Nia. "You've bought some time," he said. "For yourself. For others." Her hands trembled now, the adrenaline catching up. "That doesn't make you safe." "I know," she said. Another pause. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not kindly. Memorably. "You're braver than you are wise," he said. "But bravery has its uses." He stood, smoothing his jacket, commanding attention without effort. "This evening is concluded," he announced calmly. "I apologize for the disturbance." As he moved past her, close enough that she could feel the brush of air, he leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "We will speak again," he said softly. Then he was gone. The room erupted in noise all at once, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, phones buzzing with notifications as uploads went live. Nia stood frozen amid it all, heart pounding, legs weak, the tray still resting on the table like proof that she'd been here. She was alive. For now, the room didn't return to normal all at once. It inhaled first. A collective, shaky breath passed through the restaurant as conversation restarted in fragments, half-sentences, whispers, stunned laughter that came out too loud. Glasses clinked again, hands trembled as phones were lowered, then raised once more to replay what had just happened. Nia picked up the tray. Her fingers still shook, but they obeyed her. She turned away from the empty booth and walked back toward the service station, posture straight, steps even. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. She could feel the eyes on her anyway. Some followed her with awe. Others with calculation. A few with something darker, recognition that a line had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. A server brushed past her and whispered, "Are you okay?" Nia nodded once. It was easier than explaining that okay no longer applied. The manager hovered near the host stand, pale, opening and closing his mouth as if deciding whether to speak to her or pretend nothing had happened. He chose nothing. Nothing was safer. The kitchen doors swung open, releasing heat and noise, and Nia stepped into the familiar chaos like a diver breaking the surface of water. The clatter grounded her. The smells. The orders being called out like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. She finished her shift. That surprised her most of all. No one told her to leave. No security escorted her out. No hand closed around her arm. But every movement felt different. When she returned plates, conversations paused. When she refilled glasses, people watched her like they were trying to memorize her face. Invisibility was gone. And with it, the protection it had offered. Outside, night had settled heavy over the street. The air felt sharper, colder, as if the city itself had taken notice. Nia stepped onto the sidewalk and stopped, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. She checked behind her. No one followed. Not yet. Her phone buzzed as she walked. Messages from unknown numbers. Tags. Videos already circulating, captions racing ahead of facts. Waitress shuts down mob boss. Who is she? This woman just saved lives. She slipped the phone into her pocket without reading further. Fame was just another kind of exposure. Somewhere, a plan had been delayed. Lives had been spared, at least for tonight. But power like his didn't dissolve. It recalibrated. The boss would remember her. He had said so. Not as an enemy, necessarily. Not as an ally. As a variable. And variables were either controlled or removed. Nia walked faster, senses sharp, mapping shadows and reflections the way she'd been taught to since she was young. Survival had always been about adaptation. Tonight had just changed the rules. She reached her apartment door and paused.